educational developer at the Center for Teaching and Learning.
And hello, everyone. My name's Clarissa. I'm an Educational Development Associate at the Center for Teaching and Learning. I'm also a PhD student at the Faculty of Ed.
All right, so in terms of sort of orientation stuff, please, I think everyone now is muting their microphones as a matter of course, and that's fantastic. Feel free to use the chat window to post questions or comments, as well as introduce yourself with your name and department. We also would ask that you have something to write on and something to write with for this session. There will be a few opportunities for you to reflect. And often writing is a great way to kind of prompt your thinking in a different way. So feel free to grab that. I usually begin presentations with a land acknowledgement. And the land that I'm standing on is a little bit west of Queen's main campus, but it's still the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee. And land acknowledgements, since we're talking about inclusive classrooms, I think land acknowledgements have been one way for a number of instructors and teaching assistants to bring a sense of inclusivity, or at least enhanced awareness to the kinds of histories and contemporary realities that Indigenous peoples and non-Indigenous peoples face when they're sharing this particular place and location. For me, when I make a land acknowledgement, I try to move beyond simply acknowledging the traditional territory to say something more personal and meaningful about either my relationship to the history. So for instance, talking about my own background as a non-Indigenous person and where I come from. I sometimes talk about a specific aspect of the colonial past and present, maybe talking about the names of lands or other things that are more connected to whatever the presentation that I'm going to be giving might be. Just something to bring a bit more of a personal flavor and to start to move past more tokenistic gestures, which are important first steps, I think, especially if you can't currently pronounce the names of the two main Indigenous groups. Then simply speaking those out loud is maybe where you start, but it's important to keep going and to keep growing in terms of what you're able to share and what you share with the other people that you're engaging with. So that we can all kind of build towards that sense of self-learning. And I think self-education is really a big part of what we're talking about today as well. So here's the sort of general plan for this session, is to talk a little bit more about the importance of self-education and self-study in terms of this kind of education and this kind of work when we're talking about inclusivity in the classroom. And then we'll move on to do a segment on different terms and definitions, because I know there's a lot and it's sometimes somewhat confusing to figure out which is which and what means what. And then depending on time, we will spend some time talking about specific scenarios that particularly teaching assistants might face relating to inclusivity in the classroom, and talk about some strategies that could be used to address some of those scenarios. And then we'll share some ideas about next steps. Oh, I should say as well, before I turn it over to Clarissa, this is a very loose session plan in terms of that we have a lot of information prepared, but if it looks like as a group the discussion needs to move in a particular direction, or we want to spend more time on a particular topic, we can certainly do that as well. And so if there's questions that you have, feel free to put them in the chat throughout, and we can address those as we go and shift if we need to.
So hi, everyone. Once again, for those of you who maybe just trickled in, my name's Clarissa, and co-facilitating with me is Robin. We're both from the CTL. I'm just seeing in the chat that there's some internet issues that people are experiencing wildly. So I just want to acknowledge that we are recording the session. So if you have any friends who aren't able to connect or attend, or if you yourself are having trouble, you know, you're cutting in and out, this will be available on the CTL website, so not to worry, but I still hope that you stick around for as long as you can and participate in the ways that you can. I just want to say thank you to Robin for the introduction and the land acknowledgement. I myself would like to acknowledge I'm not in Kingston, I usually am. I'm on the land of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the treaty and traditional lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit, and particularly I'd like to acknowledge the territory of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Ojibwa, Chippewa, Huron-Wendat, and that this land is also the home of the Métis and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, who are direct descendants of the Mississauga of the Credit. And I wanted to open with a bit of my own land acknowledgement, because a big part, like Robin said, of today will be this idea of self-education. And another way that we phrased it is self-study or self-examination. And the reason why we wanted to start off on this note is because this idea of positioning yourself in the classroom is going to be really important to the whole concept of inclusive education. There really is no cookie cutter answer of how to build inclusive education, because the way in which we all exist in the classroom, in education, is particular to us. And the way that you build an inclusive environment with your students is going to depend on who they are as unique individuals, as well as who you are. And part of that is understanding, you know, what are the ways in which you exist in society as a whole? What are some of the ways that you have privileges? Where are some of the ways in which you may be marginalized? And that self-education, self-examination piece is really important, because it's going to help determine the kind of decisions that you're going to make when you're grappling with certain environments, or you're grappling with certain interactions. And also it's important for you to realize that you are impacted by your environment, and that you need to take note of, like, oh, how am I being affected in this situation, and how am I affecting others, just in virtue of me being of a very specific positionality. And when I say the word positionality, I mean things like related to our identities. So it could be things like race, it could be ethnicity. It could also be the fact, like, are you first generation student? Did you grow up in what would be considered a low socioeconomic status? Or are you an immigrant? I myself am a settler immigrant, and I know that that background in me determines almost everything that I do as a teacher. So, you know, breaking apart your identity in those pieces, realizing how all those factors influence who you are as a teacher, how you impact others, and how you exist in the classroom and exist amongst others in the classroom and beyond, is so important to the way in which you are going to build an inclusive environment. And so I just want you to keep that in the back of your head as we go through the rest of the presentation. The next piece, like we said on our agenda, is going to be looking at some foundational knowledge, some sort of, you know, really commonly used terms when we talk about inclusive education. And, you know, to sort of help you understand the nuances of your own identity, your positionality, and participate in some of this self-examination, self-education, while you sort of familiarize yourself with this language. I'm going to ask you that you think back to your own experiences as a student and think about, oh, when have I experienced something as what's being described when we go through the definitions? Like, when have I experienced, you know, one of the words we're going to talk about is diversity. When have I experienced anti-racism? And, you know, we asked you to bring out that piece of paper or something to write with. Take note of that, because we'll have opportunities to share in the chat and later on in the discussion. So we're asking you to start your journey with self-education now. And I'm excited to hear what you'll have to share later on.
Thanks, Clarissa, for that. All right, so there's a lot of different terms that get thrown around in the media, in academic research articles, in informal conversations, on social media. And we thought we'd start by kind of you know, given your own experiences and identities are so varied, and that you may have very little prior knowledge of inclusive pedagogies or what inclusivity means, or you might have quite a lot. You might have you've all got different experiences and identities, as Clarissa mentioned. We thought we'd kind of spend some time with these different definitions as well. So you'll see on the screen 5 different words: diversity, inclusion, inclusive pedagogy, equity, and anti-racism. So to start, I'd like you to write down for yourself, which term do you feel most sure about, and which term do you feel least sure about in terms of what it might mean or involve. Maybe reflecting on your own personal experiences as well. So hopefully that gave you a little bit of time. Within 1 hour, there's only so much that we can do in terms of reflecting. And I think it's important to keep that in mind, that this is a really brief overview and a really initial sort of starting point, but it's hopefully not the end of your journey exploring these topics and understanding these ideas. Similarly, now I'm going to go through some particular possible definitions for each of these terms, but of course, all of these definitions are relatively complex. The ideas involved, there's some dispute over particular aspects of them. So these again are meant to offer some clarity, but also be treated more as a starting place rather than kind of, this is the definitive version of this particular idea. So to start with equity, equity has to do with treating individuals and groups fairly, but not necessarily in the same way. So if you think about equality, that's equal, whereas equity is equitable, meaning that they're being treated fairly. Equity recognizes that there's systemic barriers or institutional barriers to participation, access, opportunity, and advancement in places like educational institutions such as Queen's, but also in workplaces, in the provision of goods and services, so shopping or marketplace kind of things. And acknowledging that those barriers exist and that action is needed to address them. Sometimes you could think about even in this picture of an apple orchard, that maybe this apple orchard is equally available to everyone, but a little kid cannot necessarily reach all those apples up at the top of the tree. Someone who's relatively short, like me, can also not reach those apples up on top of the tree. There's a ladder there, but not everyone is physically able to climb that ladder. So those are some of the physical ways that we might think about, well, how could we make those apples available to everyone in an equitable way? But of course, there's lots of different identities beyond the physical. And so equity considers how can we make things fair for everyone by all different metrics. Diversity, our second term, has to do with the idea that all individuals are unique and that we all have varied experiences, perceptions, realities, histories, approaches. It's not something measurable, so you can't talk about, well, this classroom is more diverse than this one, or this is less diverse than this one. And a particular individual can't be more or less diverse than any other. We've all got our own particular elements, and in that sense, we could all be considered equal. What happens in terms of diversity is that happens when people who are different from one another by any particular measure come together, and where everyone's different experiences are all included. So quite broad. I think often diversity gets narrowed down to maybe think about race or ethnicity specifically, but really the term just means different in different ways. So it can be quite broad in that sense. Inclusion, our third term to think about, is something around fostering a sense of belonging. It's intentionally creating the sense of belonging for everyone. It's creating a space or a virtual space or some kind of environment where all people are recognized and valued for their uniqueness. And promoting an environment where individuals can be what we talk about as their authentic selves, where they don't feel the need to hide particular aspects of who they are or conform to particular identities or ways of knowing, being, doing, seeing, believing that might be seen as sort of the way of doing things, but instead where everyone can bring themselves fully to that particular space. Somewhat aspirational perhaps, but I think that a lot of inclusive pedagogy, as well as things like decolonization and indigenization, are about aspiring and working towards and trying to enhance and make things better without perhaps never reaching that ultimate end goal of this wonderful utopia that we all would love to live in one day. Anti-racism. I really like this particular picture, and I'll talk about it a little bit more in a bit. So anti-racism has certainly come into the sort of, I would say, international conversations a lot more over the last year or so because of the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States and then globally through the summer of last year. But I think obviously it's a topic that's been around for a lot longer, but I think that you'll see the term has sort of emerged more over the last year or two, I would say. It is a recognition that racism operates on many levels, that it's not necessarily just person to person, but it's also systemic, institutional, societal, and cultural. But then anti-racism is about actively identifying and eliminating racism by changing systems, organizational structures, policies, practices, attitudes, personal behavior, societal or policy type of things, so that power is redistributed and shared equitably. And I think one of the key parts of anti-racism is the activist component to it, which is sort of why I like the seagull picture. To me, the seagull is standing up and saying, this is not right and this needs to change, and taking action. And that's really a key component of anti-racism, is that sense of action and of actively seeking out and making change, rather than perhaps noticing or becoming more self-aware, but not taking those active steps. And then our final term, inclusive pedagogy, has to do with, and I think draws upon a lot of the ideas that I've already talked about, but it involves deliberately cultivating or creating a learning environment where all students feel they belong, because they're treated equitably, because they have equal access to learning, and because they feel valued and supported in their pursuit of knowledge. And it really informs, when we talk about pedagogy, I'm talking about all parts of teaching. That might be physical or virtual spaces, whether in a classroom or in on cue or in a synchronous session like this, in an asynchronous format such as discussion boards. It means the way the course is designed. It means the way the program is designed. It means the instructional strategies that whether an instructor or a teaching assistant might use. It means how things are graded and assessed. It means policies and systems. So it's all these elements all together. And I think it's also, again, this maybe back and forth between systemic concerns around inclusive pedagogy. So for instance, what is Queen's University doing to increase inclusivity amongst its student body as a campus in terms of their education? What are they doing in terms of admissions policies? What are they doing in terms of student supports? How those, big institutional things. But it also dials right down to, what are you as an instructor or a grader or a teaching assistant, whatever your role, what are you doing to foster this sense of inclusive pedagogy within the educational contexts that you're in? So everything from the large to the small. So to come back again to these 5 terms, there are certainly some things they've got in common. They're all engaging with questions of power, privilege, bias, and engaging with systemic issues as well as individual actions. They differ a little bit in terms of the degree of action and investment on the part of the individual, and they also have slightly different focuses. So I think that it's important to see these as related but distinct from one another, rather than see them as interchangeable. And we do have some resources as well in terms of these terms, some additional resources at the end of the presentation if you're interested in digging deeper or exploring further. So at this point, I'd like you to write again, going back to your original thoughts before I began this portion of the presentation, to think about what surprised you about this discussion and where do you feel that there are still gaps. So I'll let you write for a minute and then we will see where we go from there. All right, so that's about a minute. At this point, Clarissa and I thought we might pause to see if there were questions emerging from this portion of the presentation. So if you do have questions or comments that you'd like to share, please feel free to put them into the chat, and we can move from there.
Feel also free to, share some of the things that you wrote down, like your answers to what surprised you about this discussion and where you feel there are still gaps in your knowledge, if you are comfortable. Because I bet that there would be peers in the crowd that would share some of your responses, and it would maybe benefit all of us to chat about them. So Sophia, if it's okay with you, I'll read your comment out loud. Something that surprised Sophia is that inclusive pedagogy is so extensive. And I would agree. And that's sort of one of the difficult things about pedagogy in general, is that it is so all-encompassing, and inclusion as well. And that might be something that you encounter in trying to create your own learning environment, whether it be a synchronous sort of lab or tutorial or a message board, is that there are so many things that you'll have to consider. But something I would encourage you to do is not feel like you have to do it all at once. The thing about teaching is that it is a journey, and that you improve over time. And one of the things that you can do to make it more manageable is to focus on, what is in my control, what is something that I can implement, and make smaller goals for yourself. Because I think if you allow yourself to get overwhelmed by this idea of inclusion and trying to be as inclusive in your pedagogy, it can be quite stifling, and you ultimately end up maybe not doing anything because it is overwhelming. So maybe focus in on something like that you really want to try, and just try to do that differently.
I'm seeing the comment from Mia about teachers as activists, and I think it's interesting to think about that for a moment. So for myself, I come from a background, actually, I was a faculty member for 5 years before I shifted into the teaching and learning center role that I have now. And I think I've always been relatively strident in my activism. So I definitely feel comfortable with that in terms of what I do in the classroom. But I think even just to realize that what you do as an instructor has an impact on students, regardless of whether you see yourself as an activist or not, I think is a really good thing to keep in mind in terms of the topic today. Because I think there's a lot of discussion now about the difference between intent and impact when you're talking about, say, racism in particular. That, well, I didn't intend to be a racist, but the impact was such and such. So you can stand in front of a classroom and say, well, I didn't intend not to be inclusive, but actually the impact was, regardless of your intentions, that the classroom environment wasn't inclusive for some of your students. So thinking about those kinds of, the way that we all have that obligation and responsibility, regardless of how intentionally activist we'd want to be, I think is really important. I'm just looking through the other comments. Curtis saying the interesting idea about diversity not being measurable, because they've heard things like the most diverse city and things like that. So, maybe if you define diversity in a particular way, then maybe you could measure it for sure. So if you define diversity by, say, gender, and then point out, okay, well, we know this many people identify in such and such a way, this many is this, and this many is this. But diversity itself as a term doesn't have a measurability to it.
I can read out Arthur's
Sure.
next comment, which is that you're impressed with the responsibility of Queens with these social or society problems. With your previous schools, wish your previous schools were like that. And I'm sorry to hear that you didn't receive the support, or didn't have social responsibility demonstrated or modeled for you, or created for you, really. And what I will say is that Queens itself hasn't always been as active as it's striving to be now. And I think that's important to acknowledge, because really we will never reach a point where we are the most inclusive that we can always be. There will always be things that we should consider. There should always be things that we should be striving for in terms of inclusion. And in terms of our roles as teachers in contributing to that inclusion, I think something important to remember is that it's okay to want to imagine education differently as what it was done for us, because something that's really easy for us to fall into is to teach in the ways that we were taught. And that's because that's what we know. That's what we were given. That was what was modeled for us. And, you know, as I'm someone who actually works pretty extensively with pre-service teachers, who are teachers preparing to teach in public schools or, you know, in general with children and youth. And it's something that can be very comfortable to say, well, this is how it was done for me. But something I would challenge all you to do is, when you're striving for an inclusive pedagogy, is say, okay, so this is how it was done. I don't feel great about that. How can I imagine it differently? And be a little brave in that aspect and be a little experimental, because like I said, Queens hasn't always strove to be the kind of environment it is now, and we still have lots of room for improvement, if I'm being honest. But I think it's important to recognize when progress has been made, because it means that we're capable of progress.
And I see Artur's follow-up about how to start this discussion with others that do not value these issues in a university. And I think that is a really important question, is, you know, how to bring those to the table. And sometimes it starts just with finding a community, as we've done sort of with this workshop. There's other people at this workshop who are also interested, and maybe you recognize some of the names in the participant list and you make that effort to follow up and say, hey, what did you think of that workshop? Yeah, how could we apply that within our own department or within our own teaching team? Maybe it starts at the level of, you know, you've been assigned as one of 6 TAs to work with a particular instructor. Maybe you take that step to say, hey, teaching team of 6, how might we think about this aspect within what we do in this semester? So I think sometimes just choosing, you know, what's the space where you feel like you can step forward and say something, and building from there. And sometimes it's quite small. Maybe it's just your lab partner, but maybe it turns into something larger, or depending on what your experience and identities and comfort is, it starts to become a larger conversation. And we will maybe get into, at the end of the presentation, a little bit more about kind of the power and agency that TAs have within that strange space where you're both an instructor and still a student, but kind of the power that role can play sometimes in terms of working through these issues. I'm also seeing Heidi's comment about, again, sort of reflecting on the fact that everyone's diverse and that it's not really measurable, that people are different depending on their external environments, and we influence each other. And then noting Jefferson's comment as well. And it's interesting, Jefferson, I'm reading through that you mentioned to be inclusive. I think we have to understand the barriers different people have, and the gap that I feel is that it's difficult to have enough knowledge about all different cultures. For example, as an international student, as I arrived in Kingston, I see there's a big discussion about Indigenous people here. So I feel I don't have enough knowledge on that to be more inclusive. And I think that self-awareness is a great starting place, because it's true, there is no way that as individuals we can know everything about every culture on Earth, let alone, you know, the thousands of other planets in the solar system, you know, beyond. Who knows what life is out there, right? So that kind of self-awareness of, I don't know, and I need to be educated in this way because that seems like it's important for this particular context. So dialing that down maybe to individual teaching experiences, what you find in one semester in one particular class or course might be different than the next, and being aware that it's not going to be the same context every time, and trying to make that shift as well.
And I just want to add that, you know, someone that I often reference when I try to talk about allyship, which I think extends to this conversation, is Dr. Robin DiAngelo, who works extensively on the topic of white fragility. But I think that her her thinking and her framework applies to other forms of inclusion and diversity and anti-oppression. And something that she says often is that people aren't looking for perfect allies. We're not looking for perfection. We're looking for people who are willing to put up the vulnerability and give something a try. And if they mess up, because we may mess up, to be okay with learning from that circumstance or learning from that situation and move on. Because I don't believe in perfect teachers. I don't believe that any teacher is perfect. And I don't believe that any teacher walks into a classroom with all the knowledge that they need to have in order to be inclusive. But something that I do expect from teachers is that that they have the fortitude to take on that extra learning and give things a try, and understand that maybe sometimes they'll fall short, but that doesn't make it not worth trying or not worth trying again. And luckily, when it comes to teaching, there are lots of resources. You can come have a chat with us and say, I'm having this thought and I don't know everything I need to know about the Indigenous students in my class, but I had this idea of how to support them. What do you think? And never try to take it on your own, and never let your own sort of maybe limitations in your knowledge hold you back, because I'm going to tell you right now, everyone is limited in their knowledge. And even though you may have some colleagues who may be a little further on in their journey, they didn't start where they are right now. They started in a different place, and that's okay. It's okay to be wherever you are in your learning. And thank you, Robin, for putting in Dr. D'Angelo's book. She also has like great podcasts and YouTube videos. If you don't have time to read, that's okay.
The last comment I just noticed popped in from Mia again, saying, I happen to study disability and I know this is an underrepresented issue in these discussions. Absolutely. And I think you sort of see as kind of that there's within academia, but within sort of media or national and international conversations, often these discussions kind of take particular aspects of inclusivity or diversity or equity or anti-racism, inclusive pedagogy, sometimes start to steal the spotlight away from other equally important aspects. And I think, I suppose that's maybe part of the ongoing struggle that we're all facing around these topics, is that sometimes some issues dominate more than others. And so it's important to be reminded of that as well. Clarissa, I'm wondering if you think we might be ready to move on to some of the scenarios.
Yes, but can I just follow up with one last comment? So Mia, I do think that you make an excellent point. And also, good morning, Mia is a dear friend of mine, so I just want to say hello. I think something that we'll realize as you strive for inclusive pedagogy, you'll realize that there are pockets of overlap where something that works really well for a student with a specific disability will also work well with students who maybe don't have a disability but are marginalized in a different way. And that's something that helps make it more manageable. And so again, all this information, it's so much information when it comes to inclusion and inclusive pedagogy. But when we start approaching it and taking it on chunk by chunk, you'll realize that maybe you're already doing things to make an inclusive environment. And maybe it targets, like in your mind, one specific group, but who knows, it could be helping a bunch of other different groups just because it's good pedagogy. And so that was the last point I wanted to make. But I think, Robin, you're right, it might be a good time to start with the scenarios and help take some of these questions and these concepts and attach them to the sort of like concrete situations that we may encounter.
Yeah, and just to say about these scenarios that we've tried hard to make them quite simplistic, but of course there's much more complexity in a lot of real life things. So we're trying to keep them somewhat focused so that we can talk about really specific aspects and kind of give you something concrete to take away from this. And we'll also say too that the scenarios are focused mostly on remote situations, since that's what we're doing this year, and hopefully just this year, but who knows. But also that we're focusing on situations where TAs don't have control over course content. But if that is not true for you, if you do have control over course content, then that completely opens up a whole other area. And we're happy to talk about that further, maybe towards the end in again. So let me find that first scenario. Oh, there's a nice picture of an owl, just in case. Okay, so here's the first scenario, Clarissa.
All right, so in an online discussion forum, and again, you can adapt this to be like in a tutorial, in a lab situation, that you monitor a student posts a racist argument against a particular idea. And what I'd like everyone to do is sort of take out that piece of paper and that pen, whatever you're writing with, and we'll give you a minute or two to jot down some ideas of how you think you would address the situation should you find yourself in it. And again, you can make it specific to you. It doesn't have to be an online forum. It could be a lab. It could be a tutorial. But one way I'd like to prompt you is for you to think of strategies or approaches that are proactive, which means how could you possibly prevent a situation like this from coming about? And then reactive, which is, okay, now the situation's already happened. What are you going to do? So as you maybe even create a little table for yourself, and one side say proactive, one side say reactive, and just jot down ideas. And we'll give you a couple of minutes to sort of gather your thoughts, write down some of your initial thinking, and we'll gather after you've had a chance to reflect. So once again, I'm sorry that we can't give you a ton of time to write. This is, you know, it is a 60-minute introduction really session, but maybe we can start opening up the chat to some of your responses. And like I said, we're looking for two different approaches. One that is proactive. So how could you prevent a situation like this? What would you do even before it happened? And, you know, now that it's happened, what are you going to do? And feel free either to share approaches to either one of those kind of categories. And if you're not done writing while we're discussing, please feel free to keep writing, to keep reflecting. Those notes are probably going to be beneficial for you even after the session ends.
She's Sean's comment as a proactive option requiring approval on all posts. And Curtis suggesting that it could be made very clear that the discussion forum or class is an anti-racist space. And it might even be worth extending that to talk about with your students, maybe what that looks like. What do they think an anti-racist space should involve? What do you think it should involve? And to have that kind of initial conversation, either through the discussion boards, if that's what you're doing, or maybe with a sort of live or synchronous session like this one.
I'll read Heidi, if that's okay. I'll read your comment out to the group. So to help prevent or to be proactive about the situation, passively show a sense of inclusivity and attention towards minorities or marginalized folks or people, or sorry, or who people who feel marginalized, to be reactive or respond to the situation, ask questions to the person that causes them to reflect about whether they think what they said is appropriate. And Heidi also added, I'm curious to listen to this discussion because I've never felt that I had the right response to these kinds of situations. And Heidi, I'll just say that I feel the same way, that I've been in many situations in which like, because there is like a little sense of panic there sometimes where you're like, oh, did that really happen? I think especially if it's a topic on like, you know, for this scenario, we're thinking about racism specifically, depending on, you know, your own self-examination, your own self-education, your positionality, those responses can be very varied. I'm a woman of color, and I always go into self-protection mode where I'm like, okay, just appease the person and get them out of your face. And after the fact, I'm always like, oh, that was a real lost opportunity to actually unpack what was going on there. And then I always have like a moment of like, I wish I had thought better in the moment. But the truth is that we need to have these kinds of conversations so that we feel like we have better tools in those moments. So I really thank you for being able to share that bit of vulnerability about not knowing how to act, because many of us don't know how to act. And given your positionality, it may even be a safety thing of like, you don't know how to react because you just need to get out of that situation. And I really like your idea of like sort of incorporating in a really everyday casual way a sense of inclusivity and sort of like protection of the marginalized folks in your class. Because if you normalize that kind of culture in your classroom, then everyone's going to realize, okay, this is just what it's like in my classroom. This is what it's like in this learning environment. This is the standard that we need to rise to. And so modeling that, taking the initiative to do that yourself, is a really great preventative sort of or proactive strategy. And I also like your idea of, you know, asking questions to get people to have them reflect. We're going to talk a little bit more about that later.
Yeah, I'm seeing as well comments from Badra and Curtis that are somewhat similar in terms of talking with the student that made the comment. And we will be sharing shortly a particular framework that can be helpful as a kind of do this, now do this, now do this, especially as you're trying this out for the first time, as a method for engaging with either the student that made the comment or the class as a whole. I also noted a comment from Olivia talking about proactive and prevent this from happening at all. We could propose to instructors that syllabus week includes a short module about inclusivity and anti-racism to set the tone for the course. And what I really like about that comment, Olivia, is that it's connecting back to that, what's the power and agency that you have as a teaching assistant? Well, here's an example of, oh, you can bring this idea to the instructor and maybe they run with it. Maybe they say, well, I don't know, what would a module look like? And you say, well, actually, I've got these resources, or, you know, so having that conversation is doing work around this topic as well, which is really great.
I think Sean brings up an interesting question, and Robin, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts, or anyone else in the chat. With deleting the post or keeping it from appearing at the start, where does that go if there is then a word of censorship? Sorry, my tongue is heavy today. Censorship. Is leaving it there and trying to build discussion around why it isn't acceptable a better option, or just a different option? I think that that's a really great question. So thank you for asking it, Sean. And it's honestly probably a question that's on the minds of a lot of post-secondary educators right now, because I feel like I hear a buzz everywhere about people talking about this kind of topic. And this is one of those situations where I feel like there is not one size fits all. It really will, I think, at the end of the day, depend on the nature of the message. If there are going to be some things where it's clear violence, it's clear racial violence, and in that case, my instinct would be to say, okay, I can't keep this up because it will cause continual harm. But if it's a case where it's where there is potential for learning, and we can talk about, oh, it's a microaggression or something like that. For those of you who may not be familiar with the word microaggression, it's sort of like things that where you're like, oh, was that racist? Or like, or things that come up and we don't realize the harm it could cause, there could be opportunities to have that discussion. But I'm having a hard time thinking of one answer to this because I feel like I would need to see the comment. Robin, what do you think?
No, I think Sean's final point of just a different option really gets at the opportunities within individual situations of taking different approaches depending on and evaluating, you know, as you were saying, what about the health and well-being of other students in the class who might read that comment? Is it going to cause ongoing epistemological violence or racial violence that just doesn't need to exist in the world? And you know, there's lots of debates about free speech that we will not get into, I think, within the time we have, and then maybe limits on free speech. But there is a sense of, you know, what's the impact of that going to be on the entire learning community, rather than that one student. But then also weighed against, you know, what kind of prior community have you built within that classroom? Have you already had some really intense discussions and worked through some difficult conversations as a group? So you've got that sense of group and community trust built up, where if you introduce this comment and kind of talk through it as a class, people will be ready to do that? Or is this like the first class meeting where no one knows each other and there's the first post on the discussion forum? You know, so there's that sense of community that you're evaluating as well. And I think it's really important, I think, to just step back and see what the context is and to make those kind of individual decisions. I'm seeing a lot of other great ideas emerging in the chat as well, but I'm wondering, Clarissa, if you want to maybe get to the accountable space and the action framework, just so that folks have that extra piece of material that they can rely on.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea, especially since some of the great points that folks have mentioned attaches to the two specific strategies we'd like to share with you all.
Okay, so let me move to the accountable space one.
All right, so we wanted to give you two specific strategies, and thank you all for being so engaged and sharing your own thinking. It's been a very rich discussion, but I forget who, I think it may have been Sophia and Cameron. Both of you mentioned an idea like this in the chat about, you know, how do we do something proactive, preventative, to avoid situations where something oppressive or harmful may come up. And the idea of accountable spaces came to my mind because you start right at the very beginning, or you do it throughout the course of creating a space in which folks are accountable to each other. An accountable space is basically one in which you are responsible to each other and also responsible to yourselves. And that sounds kind of vague, but it basically means that we're going through and we're realizing we're a part of a community, and that no one in this community is perfect, and that there may be things that come up that may be hurtful, but that we are leading with the idea that we are trying our best to be accountable to each other. And so some examples of what this could look like is co-creating community guidelines. And I'm really big on making it so that students participate in creating the kind of learning environment that they want to have, because that increases the level of accountability. These aren't rules that I'm telling you that we have to follow. These are rules that we all wanted. At the beginning of the class, we said, these are the kind of things that we want to see in our environment. And then we all agreed on it. So this isn't coming from a top-down approach. This is more of a horizontal sort of even playing field approach. And, you know, this is something that I've done with grade 6s. This is something I've done with grade 7s. This is something I've done with adults in workshop situations, and reminding folks continually throughout the course, saying like, oh, hey, this is something we agreed upon. And even more important than that, making note of when people are showing good examples of following the community guidelines, saying, hey, I really love that discussion post. That's a great example of accountability as we, you know, according to this community guideline, and making sure that you create space for praise and create a lot of space for praise for when it's going well. For, you know, what an accountable space could sound like would be things like providing trigger or content warning for sensitive subject matter. Accountable space, I use the term accountable space rather than safe space, because safe space is kind of misleading. There are no spaces that can be completely safe. There are things that exist in society that make it so that we different folks have different experiences of life. And rather than trying to achieve a safe space, we should achieve a space in which we are responsible to each other, because that safety isn't possible with the way our society is set up right now. And one of the ways in which we could be responsible to each other is acknowledging that people are going to have different reactions to the content that you are doing in your course. And of course, this is going to depend on the specificity of the course that you're in. But I think, modeling that and acknowledging that there could be some difficulty in the material is a really important thing to do, and a really great way to sort of proactively create that inclusive environment. And then also like modeling accountability, so using gender neutral language, the land acknowledgements, holding space for students affected by current events connected to racism and oppression. A great example is that, a lot of students are having a very, very hard time with what is happening right now in the States regarding the white supremacy and what happened in the Capitol, and acknowledging that in the class, even if it has nothing to do with the course content of your class, is really important for letting students know that they are allowed to have emotions about this. And especially for the marginalized students in your class, it allows them to know that this is a space where they can be a person, be a human. And then the ways that accountability feels like is students and educators come prepared to listen and learn with an open and humble heart. And this is a term that I always come back to, this idea of being open and being humble, because given our self-examinations or self-education, there are going to be times when we're a little uncomfortable about the ways in which we may be asked to confront our privileges. And it's okay to feel uncomfortable with that, because it is a very uncomfortable thing. But what's more important is that you understand that you have to approach these conversations with a level of humility and a willingness to be imperfect in the situation, and understand that the classroom is not a neutral space, and that people walk into the classroom with their own baggage because of their own positionalities. And that commitment to self-improvement, like I said, we're not looking for perfect teachers. There's no such thing as a perfect teacher. All I'm looking for is a teacher who is willing to listen and improve. So feel free to keep typing in the chat if you want to share your thoughts. And then for, a reactive strategy, so this is after the case, let's say, the situation came about, and now you are trying to figure out a way to sort of approach and what are you going to do after the fact. Robin and I found this great framework from Tasha Souza called the Action Framework. And basically it's sort of a set of steps that you can have in the back of your head of how to approach this in a very strategic way, in a way that sort of diffuses some of that panic that you may be feeling. And I like it because it has a mnemonic device, which is like the word action, and which helps like implant it in your memory. But it's basically ask clarifying questions, come from curiosity, not judgment, which is the idea of like, maybe they don't know that they're being racist. So ask, what did you mean by that? And can you clarify what you're talking about? Tell what you observed as problematic in a factual manner. So sticking with the facts of saying like, you said this and the impact was that, without sort of looping back to say, to, stick to the things that are non-arguable. When something racist is said, even if it's not intended, saying that the impact was this is a really good way to sort of stick with those facts. Impact exploration, that's similar to what I just said. And own your thoughts and feelings around the impact. I think especially depending on your own positionality, saying this is how I felt and saying it very factually is a way that really is direct without making it up for debate, because how you are reacting to a situation isn't up to debate and it still needs to be discussed. And then next steps, request appropriate action be taken, which is going to look different for each different scenario. And maybe it's a matter of revisiting your classroom conduct rules, your co-created rules, and saying, okay, we need to sort of rethink about, like, we need to have another discussion about why these importance, or maybe it's bringing in someone else, maybe it's bringing in the instructor and asking for support. And I'm very aware of time, which is why I rushed through this one. I'm sorry, Robin, but
That's so good. I think that we're always going to be short on time when it comes to these topics, and especially when we as facilitators are so passionate about them. I think there's a lot to talk about and to work through. So I'm glad that we at least are able to introduce these ideas to you. And as Clarissa mentioned, we're really happy to have follow-up conversations, consultations around that. And I'm actually going to zoom ahead in the slideshow. So just in case you ever want to watch this recording again, you can find out these other tricky scenarios. Here's some other strategies that you might use in future. But really, I think the important part here is to get to the reflection. So what single strategy are you going to adopt or adapt in your teaching this semester? So you can write it down on your little page of notes. If you feel like being publicly accountable and sharing it in the chat, feel free to do that. But just take 30 seconds to think about what single strategy are you going to adopt or adapt this semester right now. And then I realize that's not very much time, but hopefully you were able to come up with something. In terms of continuing the conversation, certainly, especially for those of you who are graduate students, the Educational Development Associates, of which Clarissa is one, are a really great resource that's available to you, even in this time of remote and virtual everything. So we'd strongly encourage that you get in touch directly with the EDAs. For those, but of course, even if you forget the lengthy EDA email address, ctl@queensu.ca is your one-stop shop for everything relating to teaching and learning support.
What?
Don't hesitate.
Why did you take it in?
Oh, I think someone's
so
the
you,
microphone on.
Yes.
Yeah, so feel free to reach out to either of us. The EDAs are there as well. And then you'll also see on the slides, which will be shared after the presentation, a bunch of references and further learning available to you. And then Sandra, if you could stop the recording and put the evaluation survey into the chat, that'd